If you agree that respect should never depend on age, rank, or how loud someone talks, then like and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear will remind you why some of the quietest people in uniform are the ones who carry the heaviest truths. They said she was just a clerk, just a supply sergeant pushing paperwork in a dusty armory, logging out gear no one cared to double-check. At 28 years old, Riley Ward had spent nearly a decade in service, but you wouldn't know it by the way most of the younger Marines talked around her. To them, she was the one with the clipboard and the inventory sheets, the one who nagged them about cleaning carbon off their rifles, the one who made them sign 3 times for a single launcher. They thought she was boring, background noise in a world that worshipped action and volume. And maybe she would have stayed that way, invisible and overlooked, if not for the tattoo that slid into the light one humid afternoon. But before that moment, before the room went silent and the lieutenant's smirk vanished, the story began as ordinary as any other day. The armory smelled like metal and oil, the kind of air that clung to your clothes and stayed with you long after you left. Riley's sleeves were rolled to her elbows, revealing toned forearms freckled with faint scars most people never asked about. She leaned over the counter, pen tapping against the logbook, as a pair of privates joked behind her about the weekend. They barely looked at her as they signed out gear. 2 grenade launchers stamped with serial numbers she memorized faster than they could write them down. Riley's voice was calm, clipped, precise. Confirm the count. Barrel covers secure. Optics clean. You'll sign again on return. They nodded, grinned at each other, and muttered something under their breath about supply sergeants and their rules. She didn't respond. She never did. Rules, she knew, weren't about power. They were about survival. That's when the lieutenant walked in. Fresh pressed uniform, boots polished to mirrors, chest already gleaming with campaign ribbons earned more in classrooms than in combat. Lieutenant Harris, 25, ambitious, sharp-eyed, and convinced the world bent around his rank. He strolled into the armory like it was a stage built for him, nodding at the Marines who straightened when they saw him. He didn't glance at Riley at first. To him, she was part of the furniture, background, replaceable. But when his eyes landed on the logbook she guarded, he smirked. Grenade launchers? He said loudly enough for everyone to hear. What are we, preparing for the end of the world? The privates laughed. Harris picked up one of the weapons and swung it onto his shoulder like a toy. Riley didn't flinch. She reached out and steadied it with one hand, her eyes steady but not sharp. Sir, protocol requires you check the barrel before handling. He chuckled, dismissive. Relax, Sergeant. It's not like anyone's storming the gates today. That's why they put people like you here, safe, quiet, filing papers while the rest of us train to fight. The words hung in the air like smoke, and the room shifted. The privates grinned, waiting for her to shrink back, waiting for the lieutenant's joke to land. But Riley didn't move. She simply guided the launcher back to the counter, her hand firm, her voice measured. Respectfully, sir, gear isn't a toy. Every check has a purpose. Harris shook his head, amused at her calmness. But before he could respond, the sleeve of her uniform slipped back as she reached for the pen. That was when he saw it. A mark inked into the skin just above her wrist. Black lines sharp but aged, wrapped into a banner of ice shards and crossed blades. The words beneath were simple, brutal, and chilling. Frost Banner. At first, he laughed. That's cute, he said, pointing. Did you get that in Okinawa? Some bar dare. Frost Banner, huh? Sounds like a bad metal band. But Riley didn't answer. She pulled her sleeve back down slowly, deliberately, as if she'd already lived through this reaction before. The silence that followed wasn't hers, it was theirs. Because one of the older corporals in the back of the room froze when he saw the tattoo. His laughter died in his throat. His eyes darted from Riley's wrist to the lieutenant's smirk, and suddenly his face went pale. Sir, the corporal said quietly, almost warningly. That's not a joke. The lieutenant frowned, confused. What are you talking about? It's just ink. The corporal shook his head. No, sir. Frost Banner. It's not supposed to be talked about. For the first time, Harris's grin faltered. He looked back at Riley, waiting for her to deny it, to explain it away as some tattoo she picked up overseas. But she said nothing. She just kept writing in her logbook, the scratch of her pen louder in the silence than any argument could have been. What Harris didn't know, what almost no one in that room knew, was that when Riley was 19 years old, still barely out of training, she had been pulled into something that didn't exist on paper. A mission in the Arctic, brutal and cold, under a code name whispered only in classified halls, Frost Banner. A mission that had ended with half its roster buried in snow, and the survivors carrying scars they never spoke of. To this day, even generals avoided mentioning it aloud. But here it was, etched on the wrist of a woman they'd all dismissed as just a clerk. Harris stared, searching her face for an explanation, some hint of bravado he could crush with his authority. But Riley only lifted her eyes once, steady, calm, and unflinching. "Sign the log, sir," she said. And for the first time in his career, Lieutenant Harris didn't have a comeback. The room didn't go back to normal after that. The privates who had been laughing minutes earlier now stood awkwardly, their smirks fading as they glanced between the lieutenant and the quiet sergeant with the tattoo. Paper rustled, boots scuffed against the concrete floor, but nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Lieutenant Harris, usually so quick with his confidence, seemed to have lost his rhythm. He stared at her wrist like it held a secret he didn't understand, and that bothered him more than anything. He cleared his throat, trying to recover the room. "Sergeant Ward," he said louder than necessary, "that mark. Frost Banner. Where'd you get it?" Raleigh didn't look up from the logbook. "It's personal, sir." "Personal?" His laugh was sharp, too sharp. "You're standing in a Marine armory with classified weapons, and you're walking around with a unit tattoo no one's ever heard of? You think that's personal?" From the back of the room, the corporal who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, Frost Banner isn't." "Quiet, Corporal," Harris snapped. His pride had taken over now. He turned back to Riley. "You're going to tell me exactly what that tattoo means. Right now." Riley finally looked up. Her gaze was steady, unreadable, the kind of look that had nothing to prove and everything already buried. "Sir, if you have to ask, you don't need to know." The silence that followed cut sharper than any insult. The lieutenant's face flushed, whether from anger or embarrassment no one could tell. Around them, the air thickened. The privates exchanged nervous glances. The corporal stared at the floor. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed louder, each second dragging out the tension. Harris tried to laugh it off again, but the sound was hollow now. "Come on," he said, waving toward the others. "She's just messing with us. There's no such thing as Frost Banner. It's a rumor, something washed up that's talk about to scare recruits. I've read every manual, every doctrine. You think I wouldn't know about a unit like that?" But the corporal's voice came again, hesitant but firm. "With respect, sir, some things aren't in manuals." That was the moment Harris's certainty cracked. He didn't admit it out loud, but something in his chest tightened. The corporal wasn't the type to push back unless he was sure. And Riley's silence, her refusal to deny, to defend, to explain, was worse than any boast. It was the silence of someone who didn't need to be believed. Someone who already knew what she'd lived through. Still, Harris wasn't ready to back down. He leaned forward on the counter, lowering his voice just enough to sound threatening. "You listen to me, Sergeant. If you're parading around this base with some fake tattoo, I'll have you written up. But if it's real, if you're claiming something you can't prove, you'll wish you hadn't. So which is it?" Riley slid the completed logbook toward him. "Sign here, sir." The lieutenant's jaw clenched. He picked up the pen, hovering over the page, but he didn't sign. Instead, he looked around the room, searching for support. The privates avoided his eyes. The corporal stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. Nobody was laughing anymore. And then, the armory door opened. Captain Ellis, a senior officer in his 40s, stepped inside, scanning the room. He carried the weight of years in his posture, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Harris straightened instantly, relief flickering across his face. Finally, someone higher ranked to validate him. "Captain," Harris began quickly, "you'll want to hear this. Sergeant Ward here is walking around with some tattoo. Claims it's from a unit called Frost Banner." He gestured toward Riley, smugness returning to his tone. "Ever heard of it?" "No." "Exactly what I thought. She's probably." But Ellis didn't let him finish. His eyes had already found Riley's wrist. The moment he saw the tattoo, his expression changed. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared. His jaw tightened. And then, in a voice low enough to still the entire room, he asked, "Where did you serve?" Riley's reply was quiet. "Arctic Sector, 2015. Ellis nodded once. His face, unreadable to the others, softened just slightly. He turned to Harris. "Lieutenant, step outside with me." Confused but obedient, Harris followed. The doors shut behind them, leaving the room in a charged silence. The privates exchanged bewildered glances. The corporal looked like he'd just swallowed a secret too big to contain. And Riley? She simply continued logging weapons as if nothing had happened, pin scratching steadily against the page. Outside the armory, Harris tried to explain himself. "Sir, she's claiming." Ellis cut him off. "She's not claiming anything. That tattoo isn't something you fake. Not if you want to keep breathing." Harris blinked. "So it's real?" Ellis's eyes bore into him. Frost Banner was never a unit you'll find in books. It was an operation. Frozen wastelands. Black ice nights. Missions nobody admits happened. The kind of assignments where the survivors don't brag, they just keep breathing. And if Sergeant Ward has that tattoo, then you're standing in front of someone who already proved more than you ever have. The words hit Harris like a blow. For once, he didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally stammered. "But she's just a clerk." Ellis's gaze hardened. "She's here because she chose to be. Don't mistake quiet for small, Lieutenant. You'd do well to remember that." Inside, the armory buzzed with whispered speculation. The privates leaned against the counter, wide-eyed, murmuring to each other. The corporal stood stiff, his respect for Riley now etched plainly on his face. And Riley, as always, kept her silence. She knew what they were all thinking. She'd heard it before. How could someone so ordinary carry something so extraordinary? The truth was simple. She didn't carry it to be believed. She carried it because she had survived it. And the lieutenant? He would soon learn what every arrogant voice eventually does. That some marks aren't decoration. They're warnings. They're memories. They're promises carved into flesh so that history won't be erased. The storm had only just begun. When the door opened again, the air shifted. Captain Ellis walked back in, his face unreadable, Lieutenant Harris trailing behind him with his jaw clenched tight, his earlier swagger replaced with a silence that felt unnatural. The privates straightened, the corporal's eyes sharpened, and Riley Ward didn't look up from her logbook. She finished a line, dotted the last number, then closed it carefully as if the rest of the world could wait until her task was done. But the world wasn't waiting. It was watching. Ellis's gaze swept the room. He didn't waste words. "Clear the floor," he ordered. The privates shuffled out quickly, whispering to each other as they went. The corporal hesitated for a moment, then followed, leaving only Riley, Harris, and Ellis in the armory. The clatter of boots faded down the hall until there was nothing left but the steady hum of fluorescent lights. Ellis stepped forward. "Sergeant Ward," he said quietly. "May I see it again?" Without a word, Riley rolled back her sleeve. The ink glinted faintly under the harsh light. Frost Banner. The tattoo wasn't just lines and symbols. It was memory etched into skin, a brand of survival that had cost more than anyone in that room could measure. Ellis didn't salute. Not yet. But his posture shifted, respectful, almost reverent. "I thought they were all gone," he murmured. Riley shook her head once. "Not all." Behind them, Harris finally broke. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of his own disbelief. "Sir, she's a supply clerk. You can't seriously be telling me she's—" Ellis turned sharply. "Lieutenant, that mark doesn't belong to stories. It belongs to the dead. And to the handful who came back breathing. You want proof? You don't need paperwork. You don't need a file. You just need to understand one thing. Nobody outside Frost Banner would ever wear that ink. Nobody." Harris faltered. The words didn't fit into his world of manuals and lectures, where everything had an explanation and every answer was in the training guide. He looked at Riley again, really looked this time, and for the first time he saw more than a clerk. He saw the scars on her arms, faint and pale but carved by cold and fire. He saw the steadiness in her gaze, the kind of quiet weight that came from seeing too much too soon, and it unsettled him more than any reprimand ever had. Still, he tried to recover. If that's true, then why is she here? Why is she just? Because she chose to be. Ellis cut him off. "You think survival doesn't give people the right to choose where they stand? You think they owe you their story? Lieutenant, sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who stop chasing titles and start carrying silence instead. Don't ever mistake that for weakness." The lieutenant swallowed hard. His arrogance had cracked. His voice was smaller now. I didn't know. Riley's eyes lifted, locking onto his. Her voice was calm, even, but it cut through the room like steel. That's the problem, sir. You didn't want to. The words hung there, heavy, undeniable. Harris had no answer. Ellis broke the silence. He stepped closer to Riley, and in front of the stunned lieutenant, he straightened his shoulders and raised his hand in a crisp, flawless salute. The room froze around the gesture. Salutes weren't casual. They weren't symbolic. They were declarations. And for a captain to offer it first to a sergeant, it was louder than any speech. Riley hesitated only a second before returning it, her movements precise, steady, as if muscle memory had never left her. For the first time, the lieutenant saw respect not demanded, not argued for, but given freely. When Ellis lowered his hand, he spoke quietly. "This base doesn't know who you are, Ward. That's fine. They don't need to. But I know. And he glanced at Harris. He will learn. Because silence may protect you, Sergeant, but ignorance never protects them." Riley didn't reply. She didn't need to. She picked up the pen, slid the logbook forward, and with the same unshaken calm as always, said, "You still need to sign, sir." Harris's hand trembled slightly as he scribbled his name. It wasn't the ink that mattered. It was the shift. For the first time, the lieutenant understood that the woman he'd mocked carried more weight than his stripes ever had. And for the first time, he couldn't meet her eyes when he handed the pen back. Word spread, as it always does. By evening, whispers of Frost Banner wound through the barracks like smoke, carried on hushed conversations and stolen glances. Some Marines dismissed it as rumor. Others believed every word. But all of them looked at Riley Ward differently when they passed her in the hall. They didn't laugh. They didn't smirk. Some even nodded. And for the ones who had mocked her most loudly, silence suddenly seemed the safest response. The lieutenant kept his distance, his arrogance muted, his steps quieter. Pride could be rebuilt, but not in the same way. Not after that. And Riley? She never spoke of it again. She showed up the next morning with the same rolled sleeves, the same clipboard, the same pen scratching across the page. She logged rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers. She checked barrel covers and serial numbers. She enforced rules no one wanted until the day they needed them. To the unknowing eye, she was still just a clerk in an armory. But to those who had seen the tattoo, to those who had witnessed the captain's salute, she was something else entirely. A reminder that some legacies don't need medals or titles to carry weight. A reminder that silence itself can command respect. At the end of the week, as the sun dipped low over the motor pool, Harris found himself outside the armory again. He stood there longer than he meant to, staring at the closed door, rehearsing words he wasn't used to saying. Finally, he stepped inside. Riley was there, as always, head bent over the logbook. She didn't look up. "Sergeant," he said, voice low, stripped of its sharp edges. "I owe you an apology." Riley paused, then met his gaze. She studied him for a long moment, then simply said, "Don't apologize to me. Just lead better than you did yesterday." And with that, she returned to her work. The lieutenant stood in silence for a moment longer before nodding, more to himself than to her, and walking out. The logbook closed. The weapons were secured. And in the quiet hum of the armory, the truth lingered. Some battles are fought in silence. Some victories go unannounced. And some warriors carry their legacy not on their chest, but under their skin. Riley Ward was one of them. And for those who had seen her tattoo, Frost Banner was no longer just a whisper. It was a warning,